Welcome, dear friends, to this session for Empty Cloud Monastery. Looking today at a couple of suttas on the topic of the Buddha's great patience and compassion towards all beings, even when he was confronted, as he was many times, by beings who were abusive and hostile and disrespectful towards him. So this is the theme of today's session. I'd like to begin by paying homage to our teacher, the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So welcome again to those who've joined the live stream and also to everyone who's watching later. So I'd like to share a couple of suttas with you today, and they're just a small sample, these suttas, of the many, many teachings where we can see the Buddha addressing, relating to hostility, abuse, and beings who are challenging him and trying to pick a fight with him, or even trying to harm him, trying to kill him. There are at least two examples that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with of times when the Buddha's life was actually seemingly threatened by Angulimala, the serial killer, who the Buddha approached in order to support and help him to come out of his killing and to enable him to actually become a fully liberated being. The Buddha could see that this person had great potential, and so he was willing to put himself in the presence of this serial killer. And then also the Buddha's cousin, Devadatta, who was very jealous of him, who didn't perceive clearly their relative status spiritually, and who wanted to compete with the Buddha, and take his followers, take his disciples away, and who just became completely enraged and went a bit crazy and tried to kill the Buddha on many occasions, trying to attack him through different means. So, the Buddha's life was not an easeful one after he became the Buddha. He could have had a very easeful, peaceful, untroubled existence, but he chose instead to put himself out there and to teach the multitudes of beings, human beings and other beings, to spread the Dhamma that he had uncovered, discovered, rediscovered. So, as I say, these suttas I'm going to share with you today are just a very small example of the many instances where the Buddha was approached by hostile beings. And it's just so beautiful for us to learn by the Buddha's example, to see how he related to abuse and hostility, so that we can actually apply this to our own situations. And there are many teachings in this sutta that help us to find our way. So we can all, can't we, experience hostility, offensive speech, and abusive behavior happens. And, it's so important for us not to get entangled in negativity, reactivity, blame of ourselves, blame of the other. And so I feel that these suttas are showing us the way to come out of complexity, come out of trying to understand the workings of karma, the law of cause and effect, which we will never fully grasp, and to fall back on, come back to center ourselves in how we can skillfully relate to difficulties in our life in such a way that we're turning them around and making them the grist for the mill, the ways in which we can actually move forward on the path to liberation. And of course, this is doable, but we certainly need resources and skills to help us not to fall into the mire of reactivity, not to lose ourselves, in confusion when we have difficult things happen for us. So let's begin, with one of these suttas, Spiky meets the Buddha, to see how the Buddha dealt with a very unpleasant visitation. So I posted in the chat the various references to these suttas if you want to look them up later. But here we have it's Sutta Nipata 2.5, Suchiloma Sutta with Spiky. This is Bhante Sujato's translation of Suchiloma. Very good translation. This is a being called Spiky, and he's a spirit. Probably would have been, invisible to most human beings. But of course, the Buddha could see beings in all different planes of existence and relate to them and teach them. We can recall, friends, that the Buddha was tirelessly teaching not only in the human realm, but he was also, busily teaching beings from all different levels of existence, from higher angelic or god-like realms, all the way down to the lower realms of ghosts and spirits, and even hell realms. So there's a lot we don't know about the Buddha's ministry, Anyway, let's begin with this sutta. Ewa me sutta, so have I heard. At one time, the Buddha was staying near Gaya, on the stone-cut ledge in the haunt of Spiky, the native spirit. And there were these two native spirits, Shaggy, Karo, the Yaka, and Suchiloma, the Yaka. Shaggy and Spiky, passing not far from the Buddha. So he's in their territory. This is where they dwell. And so they start talking about the Buddha. That's an ascetic. No, it's not. He's a faker. We'll soon find out. And they go up to him, and Spiky leaned up against the body of the Buddha. I mean, how outrageous, how presumptuous, how disrespectful. So he's leaning up against the Buddha, and of course he's spiky like a hedgehog, like a thistle. This is his body that he has. The Buddha pulled away, and Spiky says to the Buddha, "Are you afraid?" "No, I'm not afraid," replied the Buddha, "but your touch is unpleasant." Papaka, it actually means evil. It's nasty. You're spiky. "I'll ask you a question," says Spiky, and he addresses the Buddha as ascetic, samana. Again, mightily disrespectful to speak to the Buddha in this way. And he goes on even further in his outrageous behavior. He says, "If you don't answer me, I'll drive you insane, or explode your heart, or grab you by the feet and throw you to the far shore of the Ganges." So this is appalling behavior. And he's trying to frighten the Buddha. So he really doesn't realize who it is he's speaking to. The Buddha replies, "I don't see anyone in this world, with its gods, Maras, and Brahmas, this population, these humans, the ascetics and Brahmins, gods and humans who could do that to me. But anyway, ask what you wish." So this, I feel, is very significant for us to consider. The Buddha is not offended. The Buddha's not shaken. The Buddha's not annoyed. He's not reacting in any way at all. And, because he's able to maintain, of course, equanimity, poise, centeredness, well-being, then the Buddha is not creating any more trouble here. So there is a hostility, there's a rudeness and obnoxious behavior, even threatening violence. And the Buddha is just not participating in that scenario. And so he's in a different scenario, he's in a different space, and he can respond from that place, the place of the Buddha, the place of Nibbana. And so with great compassion, he's willing to have a conversation. And I find that, this lens, then, we're also able, in reading the sutta, to step into this framework, to see through this lens of compassion, and reflecting kindly on the situation. We can see how these two yakas, and particularly Spiky, the spirit, he actually wants to connect. He actually wants to relate to the Buddha. He's actually maybe curious about him. This person's come into their space, and he is magnificent. He is peaceful. He is radiant. He is so impressive. I imagine, one could imagine, right? The Buddha has come, and these spirits know nothing about him, perhaps, just another samana, another ascetic, dressed in robes with a shaven head. And yet, they want to connect. At least Spiky does. But they're both actually, aren't they, talking about him, wondering about him. And so the only way, if we look through with a heart of compassion, we can see that the only way such beings who are living in a rougher, coarser realm, for whom violence and harm may be the norm, who don't have the refinement even of human beings, who don't have the understanding, perhaps, of sila, of how to live virtuously, or the importance of having a virtuous mind and heart. They don't know any of those things. And so the way that they can relate is just like this. This is their way, perhaps you could say, even of being friendly. And I personally have had experience on Tudong. Many times I've gone wandering, and it's very helpful practice for monastics to get out of our monasteries and to be wandering around, literally wandering in samsara, just wandering around and meeting people randomly. And not only that, but also as mendicants, having the relationship of opening to depending on people for material support, which is for us a great heart opening when we're relying on others to feed us and to offer us shelter. We're wide open, and we have a gaze of appreciation and loving kindness, and that is the practice for us. But meeting all sorts of people who don't know who we are, what we represent, for whom we are strange, maybe even threatening, maybe something like like we're moving into their territory, invading their territory, their space. And so many different interactions we can have with people. Mostly, of course, people are extremely kind, generous and friendly and polite. But every now and then, different things can happen. And especially with young people, with young kids, adolescents, I've had a few interactions where the kids have been very hostile or rude or offensive, and recognizing with a heart of compassion that, again, just like these two yaka, these two spirits, Spiky and Shaggy, that these kids are trying to connect in the only way that they can connect, which is through bravado, you know, putting the other one down, being a little bit disrespectful in order to feel empowered. People only speak and behave in harmful ways because of their suffering. And we know that, of course. And it really behooves us to remember that whenever, isn't it, we're dealt a little taste of that energy that they're dealing with all the time. So here we are, coming back to the sutta. The Buddha is, you know, he could easily have dismissed, walked away from, said something to, in a way, block or shut down this interaction. But he does the opposite. He's inviting conversation. He's opening to connect with these beings. And of course, in my experiences on Tudong, when I've been confronted with hostility or disrespect or unfriendliness, that is the movement. The heart movement is to sort of get interested in what's going on for you and how can I make this good? You know, how can I turn this interaction around so that it becomes something that's beneficial to you, where we can actually come to some place of real meeting. And when people really meet, isn't it, when beings come together in understanding, of course, there we have goodwill. It's a given. So the Buddha, coming back to the sutta now, he's inviting connection and offering what he can to these beings. So he says, yes, I don't see anyone who can harm me in the way that you're threatening to do. But having said that, anyway, ask whatever you wish. And then Spiky addressed the Buddha in verse, and he asks him some wonderful Dharma questions. Here is the true Spiky, you know, here is the being who's trying to figure out how to find happiness, how to move forward in a good way, just like every being everywhere, friends. And he says, where do greed and hate come from? Where does discontent, desire, and terror arise from? Where do the mind's thoughts originate? Like a crow let loose by boys. So he's really insightful. I mean, he can perceive that his mind is like all minds until they are on the Dhamma path, until they are moving towards liberation, deeply confused and wild, like a crow let loose by boys, flapping and, you know, struggling in every moment. So these questions from the heart, having had his banter with the Buddha, having sort of asserted himself over the Buddha in the ways that he felt he had to, now he's really asking important questions. And the Buddha responds, greed and hate come from here. From here spring discontent, desire, and terror. Here's where the mind's thoughts originate, like a crow let loose by boys. Born of affection, originating in oneself, like the shoots from a banyan's trunk, the many kinds of attachment to sensual pleasures are like a camel's foot creeper creeping through the woods. Those who understand where they come from, get rid of them. Listen up, spirit. They cross this flood so hard to cross, not crossed before, so as not to be reborn. Ayya. So here we are, the Buddha's giving this beautiful Dharma teaching to Spiky, the Yaka, and essentially telling him all the difficulties that you're experiencing, all the painful emotions, desires, hate, love, all the confusion in your mind, the origination of the thoughts in your mind, they all come from here. They're all yours. They're all your responsibility. There's nothing outside of yourself to point the finger of blame towards. Here is the place. And for you to recognize that, for us, friends, to recognize that is then the invitation for us to turn our attention here and root out all these causes of suffering. So the Buddha's giving really a magnificent teaching, which encapsulates, doesn't it, the whole spiritual path to take responsibility. And, you know, we can sometimes fail to appreciate the fullness of this guidance, of this teaching, recognizing, like the Buddha says to Spiky here, the cause of all our suffering is this desire, which is like a creeper that makes its way throughout the forest. It kind of insidiously gets everywhere and takes over and will destroy everything in its path over time. This is the nature of desire. This is the root of our suffering. From desire springs aversion. And the root of that desire is ignorance, is not seeing things clearly. And so here we have, it's like the teaching of the Four Noble Truths in this beautiful verse form in this sutta, and this fullness of the teaching to take 100%, responsibility for our suffering. So yes, when we're, as in this sutta, the examples right here for us, when we're assailed by difficulties, when it seems that we're being approached from outside hostilely, or we're having to deal with injustice, we're having to deal with a threat of violence or harm from outside, how easy it is to point the finger and to feel deeply and to know, that the cause of the suffering comes from over there. If they were not doing that, if he wasn't saying that, if she hadn't done that, then everything would be fine. How can I be responsible for the harm that's done to me? So this is a very full teaching here that is really, in a way, like the sword of wisdom cutting through our why me questions, our natural, in a way, inclination to blame others for our suffering. This sort of wisdom cuts through these projections, these tendencies to project our suffering outside of ourselves. And the Buddha's inviting us to recognize that all the suffering we experience starts here. And it's complicated. And I feel, not that it's complicated, but that our minds are complicated and that we can lose sight of this reality. And what makes it palatable, personally, I feel, is compassion. To have compassion. So in the case of others, if we see others being harmed, others as victims of aggression from outside of themselves, others being subject to great injustice, being treated very poorly, very badly by an aggressor, by somebody who's more privileged, who has more power, more might. When we see this, it doesn't help to say to the person who's being persecuted, or the people who are being persecuted, well, you must be 100% responsible for that, because we're all responsible for our suffering. That wouldn't help. It's not actually even true. In the bigger picture, there is karma, there is cause and effect, but we can't fully understand that. We can't understand, can we, why terrible things happen to good people all the time, and why great things happen to terrible people. You know, people who hurt and harm and abuse can be rewarded for that in this lifetime. We can see that around us. And so we can't make sense of these very dissonant situations for us. But we can recognize that, yes, there are causes. Everything arises from a cause. We don't know what the causes are. We can't see the bigger picture. And in the case of others who are suffering abuse, who are suffering injustice, even violence, even threats against their very lives, our response, our skillful response to this is great compassion, is it not? Great compassion, not to presume to teach them anything, but to recognize the suffering and to do anything and everything we can, everything within our means, within our scope, to try to alleviate that suffering, to try to put right what is wrong in that situation, to try to work against injustice, to help the victim and to also help the aggressor in any ways that we can to diffuse suffering. When it comes to ourselves, this teaching in this sutta, Suchiloma Sutta, is to be taken to heart and to be appreciated in its fullness, in its, in a way, simplicity, its profound simplicity, that yes, we are 100% responsible for whatever we experience, and we can work with that. So for ourselves, sure, we can have great compassion if we're hurt and harmed by others, sometimes out of the blue, for no apparent reason. We can have difficult, painful, unjust things happen for us. But when this happens for us, great compassion for ourselves and for the other, for all others involved in any scenario that we find ourselves in. But also this understanding that if I'm suffering, then that is my responsibility. That is my work. My work is to be present for that suffering and to understand the suffering, where it's coming from. And it's always going to be, of course, coming from within, coming from reactivity. There may be some greed there, some desire, some hatred, some reactivity, some negativity, some confusion. And this is our focus then. Because it's only really, isn't it, when we take responsibility that we can bring our attention to bear in the most fruitful way, so that we can root out the defilements. And every situation, every experience gives us this possibility. How wonderful. So just as in the simile of the saw, the Buddha's advising, not to have even a trace of animosity towards the people who are tormenting us, but rather to focus on our own hearts and cultivate and develop good qualities, even in such a moment, friends. So this teaching is profound and yet very simple. And for ourselves, always applicable when we cast our gaze around us and see the world. Really, there are times when Dhamma teaching can be of value, and there are times when compassion is called for. And this compassionate eye, the compassionate gaze that can only seek the benefit and well-being of all beings, and how to work towards that. So I hope that makes sense. And I'd like to bring in another sutta at this point. I'll just touch on one, actually. I'll just touch on the Alawaka Sutta as an example, again, of the Buddha having to deal with really quite hostile behavior. So I'm going to just show you just the introduction to Alawaka Sutta, which is another incidence of a spirit who comes to see the Buddha. And actually, it's another instance of the Buddha in his wandering coming to a place which is the haunt of this particular yaka called Alawaka. So again, the Buddha goes into the territory of this being, and this being then has his reaction. And I would assume that this being would have a similar reaction to any human being coming into his domain. And this is his reaction. He says to the Buddha, "Get out, ascetic." And the Buddha responds, "All right, sir. All right, friend, Awuso." So the Buddha calls him friend, even as he's being shouted at, abused. And then Alawaka pursues the Buddha. He leaves. The spirit comes after him, and he says, "Get in, ascetic." "All right, sir," says the Buddha, and he returned to the haunt of Alawaka. And this happened, friends, 3 times. Many of you will be very familiar with this sutta. So 3 times the Buddha is being asked to get in, get out. And what is he doing? He's actually following through. He's saying, okay, and he's willing to go with the whims of this spirit. And again, the threats. After the Buddha has been tested by this spirit, he's been, he's been harried really in and out of this perhaps cave or space of this spirit. Once the Buddha has complied with all these demands, then Alawaka starts to speak to him. And what happens? I'll invite you to read the sutta at your leisure, friends. It's Sutta Nipata 110, also in the chat, the reference is there. But basically, Alawaka starts to ask questions about practice, how to be happy, how to find peace and well-being. And so here we can see that, for me, there's a sense of this being asserting again himself over the Buddha and needing to order the Buddha around. And rather than just banishing him from the spirit's territory, perhaps there's something about the Buddha that is so attractive to these beings that they don't actually want to see this person walk away. And so Alawaka gets him to come back, and again to go, and again to return, really just picking up the kind of energy of such a being. Agitated, hostile, in a way mischievous, challenging, and then later he starts threatening in the same way as Spiky. If you don't answer my questions, I'm going to rip your heart out. These kind of comments. And again, the Buddha is completely equanimous, completely at peace, not frightened, and not upset in any way. So again, this example for us. I'd like to share now a slightly different sutta. And this is where the Buddha's addressed by a human being. He's speaking with a human being, but who is also hostile, offensive, the abuser. This is Kosa Sutta. And references in the chat, it's Samyutta Nikaya 7.2. So let's just read through this sutta. At one time, the Buddha was staying near Rajagaha, the bamboo grove, the squirrel's feeding ground. Brahmin Bharadwaja the rude heard a rumor that the Brahmin of the Bharadwaja clan had gone forth from lay life to homelessness in the presence of the Buddha. So he was very unhappy about this. One of his people had become a disciple of the Buddha. Again, we get the sense, don't we, friends, that we human beings, and indeed all beings, in the case of the yakas also, there is this territoriality. What's mine? I'm going to guard it, I'm going to protect it, I'm going to fight for it. And you're the alien, the foreigner, and therefore the enemy. And this is very interesting to take in, and how it is that we can find beings relating to one another in such hostile ways due to these very basic animal instincts. Do we have these? Can we be aware of these instincts in ourselves? Can we find ways to work with them? So this Bharadwaja the rude, angry and displeased, went to the Buddha, and he abused and insulted him with rude, harsh words. We don't get the script of this rudeness, but we can imagine. And the Buddha, after he's had this abuse hurled at him, he says to this Brahmin, "What do you think? Do friends and colleagues, relatives and kin and guests still come to visit you? Sometimes. Do you then serve them with food? Sometimes. But if they don't accept it, who does the food belong to? In that case, it still belongs to me. In the same way, Brahmin, when you abuse, harass, and attack those who do not abuse, harass, and attack, we don't accept it. It still belongs to you, Brahmin. It still belongs to you." Someone who, when abused, harassed, and attacked, abuses, harasses, and attacks in return, is said to eat the food and have a reaction to it. But I neither eat your food nor have a reaction to it. It still belongs to you, Brahmin. It still belongs to you. Concerning Master Gotama, the king and his retinue understand. The ascetic Gotama is a perfected one, and yet he still gets angry. From where would come anger for one free of anger, tamed, living justly, freed by right knowledge, peaceful and unaffected? When you get angry at an angry person, you just make things worse for yourself. When you don't get angry at an angry person, you win a battle hard to win. When you know that the other is angry, you act for the good of both, yourself and the other, if you're mindful and stay calm. People unfamiliar with the teaching consider one who heals both, oneself and the other, in this way, to be a fool. And actually, after hearing this, Bharadwaja the rude becomes a disciple of the Buddha, and he eventually becomes an arahant. So very happy ending to this unsavory tale. But you know, here we have it. And the advice here is so pertinent, I'm sure, for all of us. Yes, it's a battle hard to win, the battle to maintain, to sustain peace, well-being, and even well-wishing for all beings when we're subject to abuse. We can so easily, we're programmed, we're conditioned, aren't we, to feel, many things, and especially to, in our minds, feel that's not fair, that's not right, they're hurting me, they're in the wrong. And with those kinds of thoughts and the natural feeling of, you're met by fire, you're given the heat of anger, the very natural tendency for that heat to begin to stir up some flames within. All of that can happen for us, and we can so easily then lash out in speech or even in action, to want to put things right, to want to, teach that person a lesson. And even if we say and do nothing because we are civilized human beings, we're polite, we are cultivated, we don't show anger, we don't act out of anger, even then we can find, can't we, that there can be a fire that's lit within, and we can really smolder and relive difficult situations again and again, thinking about what we might have said, might have done, how we might in some way get revenge. So we can either react instantly or we can have a slow burn going on for us. And all of this is just so much suffering. So the teaching here is to be one who doesn't allow the gifts to be given. We don't involve ourselves. If someone's angry and hostile, we recognize, we understand. The Buddha's teaching is clear to us that this is not me, this is not mine. These are not for me. These words of abuse, this anger, this offensive behavior, this injustice, this cruelty, nothing to do with me. It's not mine. I have no need to receive it. And if we're not receiving, then that hostility stays with the other. And I can feel this out energetically. I wonder if you can appreciate with me also the sense of it's like an energetic exchange, and it's a choice. And we can literally stay centered in ourselves and maintain our well-being in any situation if we understand that there's a potential for receiving and that we have a choice. We don't have to receive anything, We can be like rather than being like a dustbin, into which things get stuffed and sort of fester away, we can be more like a waste disposal system, There's a throughput. Rubbish comes along and it just comes in and it goes straight out again. There's no sticking. And if we're really mindful, really present, understanding these teachings, understanding the Four Noble Truths, then we can be just like that. There's a flow. And we're recognizing that this doesn't belong to me. What I'm appreciating, what I'm observing around me doesn't belong to me. How much more it doesn't belong to me when even this body, this mind, don't belong to me. When I'm observing reality here, and there's a constant flow of experience, and there's this letting go, this attitude of letting go, even of my own greed, hatred, and delusion, then how can I make anything of the greed, hatred, and delusion of another that comes my way? Let it flow through, not to react, not to receive. And this ability to maintain one's equanimity and a peaceful, compassionate heart is what brings peace into the world, isn't it, friends? And so many examples of great beings who have received and experienced so much abuse and harm, persecution, profound degrees of harm over considerable periods of time. I think of people like Nelson Mandela. I think of the Tibetan monastics imprisoned and tortured for many years, who come out of that experience and express how their main challenge was, of course, to maintain this compassionate, peaceful heart. Nothing else matters. Just this ability to take responsibility for our own suffering and to work with whatever arises and to make peace with that. And then, friends, when we have this, in a way, intentionality, when we have this attitude towards our experience, we're not only bringing peace and well-being here in our own hearts, cultivating and aiming to maintain peace and well-being here, but also we can give so much to the troubled world around us in our ways of relating, in our attitude towards others, to bring coolness, to bring forgiveness, to bring understanding, to bring a heart of compassion to bear. And in this way, we're, putting out fires here and there. We're bringing coolness here and there. We're bringing the Dhamma into the world. So let's take encouragement from these teachings and refer to them again and again, and remember there's no place in our hearts for reactivity, for projecting our pain outwards, for judging others who are harming others. There's no place for that, but only for this way of practice, of taking responsibility and applying the Dhamma to every experience, letting go compassionately, kindly, peacefully. Sadhu. Ewan. So friends, thank you very much for your patient listening, and I'm going to have a look at the chat and just see if you have any questions, comments, reflections on this topic. Thank you for your kind attention, and thank you for your good wishes. It's great to see all your names there. And we have one comment which I'd like to share from Nico. Thank you, Nico. Says, I thought the Buddha called his cousin the son of perdition when cousin was trying to take over. Buddha was honest, called him out. One can be honest with compassion. Yeah, thank you, Nico. Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are times when the Buddha was really hard on people who were behaving unskillfully. And he would say, you foolish person, you're behaving in a really ignorant way. And I don't know the exact instance that you're referring to, the Buddha's telling Devadatta that he's the son of perdition, but surely the truth was that Devadatta was really harming himself. He ended up in a hellish situation within himself because he was trying to harm a Buddha. It doesn't get much worse than that, really, for us to have that kind of state of mind that would want to harm a Buddha. So, indeed, and there are a number of examples out there, Nico, where the Buddha was really pointing out the faults of others. And my sense is that always with compassion, always for a good reason. The way the Buddha taught is the way he advised us to speak also, to always speak the truth, to speak when it's helpful, when there's some benefit in what we're saying, to find the right time to speak when, even though our speech is to benefit others, it may not be received easily by another. So when it comes to feedback that's going to be hard for the other person to hear, even though it may be very helpful and true, what we wish to share for the benefit of that person with kindness in our hearts, we can choose the time with great care. So my sense is that the Buddha would, of course, have been manifesting as a great example of these Dharma teachings. And so behind the rebuke was always a heart of compassion. And I can only imagine, Nico, that that heart of compassion would be felt by the other. So we can feel it, can't we, friends? When someone's abusing us out of hostility and hatred, we can feel that energy and have great compassion for them. When someone's giving us feedback out of kindness and consideration for our well-being, we can feel that. Maybe we might resist feedback even when it's really well intentioned. We may want to shrug it off or to find fault with it. When it's true and there's something there for us, when we're given feedback in a kind way, then often, even if there's some initial resistance to that, we can find ourselves opening and willing to hear and consider deeply the feedback. There's a difference, isn't there? We can really sense when the other has a heart of loving kindness, or sense when there's hostility there, and deal accordingly, to receive the gifts that are given kindly, and to simply not receive the gifts that are given out of hostility, hatred, and ill will. And this is our work, to discern and to, whether we're receiving words or actions from others, or rather we're being offered words or actions of others that are kind or unkind, that are skillful or unskillful, let our attitude be one of compassion and kindness towards the other, either way, because it's in our interests to maintain that eye of benevolence, that heart of kindness towards all beings. Thank you very much, Nico, for your question, your comment. Appreciate. And see if there's anything else, friends. Yeah, thank you, Joseph. Any advice to prepare compassionately for the severe pain of passing a kidney stone? Ouch, ouch. I feel for you, or whoever you're referring to here. Physical pain, and that's one of the most painful, I believe, physical experiences, to try to pass a stone, kidney stone or a gallstone, and the body squeezing against this obstruction and trying to push it out. We can relate this, I'm sure, friends, to our practice in many ways, on many levels. In this case, how to prepare compassionately for something painful. I would say to see if you can make space, as you are doing in your question, for this possibility, to find ways to ease the body. Anything you can take in the way of medicine, any advice and support you can get from your doctors and healers as to how to deal with this situation, any ways in which you can prevent further painful arisings through your diet and your lifestyle and your water intake and so forth. And then, if the pain comes in, to be mindful, to be practicing meditation, to be with the pain, and to be looking up for the body, to have a sort of awareness of the fullness of your physical experience, to breathe deep, and to take whatever remedies and painkillers you might need at the time. It's interesting how I'm just aware, because I used to be a medic, that this kind of pain, it's very difficult to stay still, and so it can be helpful to actually be moving the body rather than trying to fight that inclination to keep moving, to move around. It helps to massage that area. Um, but above all, to be mindful and to be compassionate. And the fear that can come up in painful situations and the negativity that can manifest in the mind. We can have all sorts of thoughts about what's happening, to notice these tendencies. And with mindfulness, we can just keep letting go, and just be with what is, which is simply physical pain in this moment. So please resource yourself. Please take all the help and medical support that you need and have it taken care of. And consider these ways of working with the discomfort, the pain. Thank you, Joseph, for your question. We have from Bhavani. Thank you, Bhavani. Namaste. Won't it be chaotic in monasteries, Ayya? I don't really know what that means. Sorry. If you've got more to say, I can see actually Bhavani has another comment just to see if it adds. Are you in solitude, Ayya? Thank you, Bhavani. Won't it be chaotic in monasteries? I'm not quite sure what you mean, but adding that to your question about solitude, maybe I can say a few words that may relate to where you're coming from. I hope so. When we have people together, community, groups of people, things can get quite chaotic. There can be a lot of confusion. Why? Because we're all different, and we all may have different ways of doing things. We all may have different ideas, views, and opinions about things. And this is a great opportunity for practice. One of the reasons that monastics do very well to come together and live in communities, because it gives us the opportunity to develop the skills required, just as in these suttas, friends, the ability to not be reactive, to have a compassionate attitude towards one another, so that we can harmonize, so that we can learn from each other, we can get to understand more and more, the human heart through our interactions with each other. So yes, it's chaotic to have people living together. The more people, the more chaotic. But with the Buddha Dhamma, we can find our way to really skillfully work for harmony, work for peace and community, and learn so much in the process. Develop so much wisdom, so much compassion in the process. And of course, find ourselves uprooting our causes of suffering within in the process. I'm not in solitude, Bhavani. No, I'm living with my elderly parents, taking care of my father, who's 90 now and has a number of health issues. And so I'm quite closely living with two others who've known me all my life and who I've known all my life. And this is a great opportunity also to practice. And it's quite easeful because we're family. So with family, there's often, isn't there, a kind of familiarity. And yet there are opportunities to dive deep into the conditioning that we share and to understand better, the reasons why we're here, the work that it has to be done. So thank you, Bhavani, for your comments. And I hope what I've said in some way meets what you were expressing. And friends, we've got just a minute to go. I really appreciate your consideration in the chat of the timing. It's really wonderful because we just have one more comment question from Nico again. Thank you, Nico, who says, the example of Thich Nhat Hanh comes to mind. All that he suffered in Vietnam. He was so honest about evil and suffering with compassion. Yes, Yes, thank you, Nico. Isn't that true, friends? Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, who's so recently passed away, what a shining example he is of compassion meeting violence, forgiveness meeting harm. A man who lost so many of his family members in the genocide that happened in Vietnam, and who had the heart of a wise sage and was able to, through his entire life, work towards healing and peace and understanding, and who helped so many of us in that process. He had a very wide reach, many, many, many disciples, many monastics he ordained, wonderful communities that are still thriving today. Thich Nhat Hanh, great example for us. And his teachings are so beautiful. His Dharma is so beautiful, so refreshing, his poems and his talks. So thank you for bringing in Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh for us today, Nico. Friends, we'll finish here with great gratitude to you all for your kind comments and your patient listening. Let's finish with 3 sadhus, paying respect to our teacher, the Buddha. Sadhu, 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 anima